Hi, so I'm Brian Erlocker, and as my contribution to this larger conversation about the Arctic, I'd like to talk about some of the geostrategic questions that relate to security in the Arctic and kind of do a review of what makes the Arctic a unique environment when it comes to security, and maybe talk a little bit about what we might expect from the different countries and actors that are active in the Arctic and trying to navigate what we sometimes talk about as an anarchic international system, a system in which there's nobody in charge making rules that's in a position to enforce those rules, that states are kind of trying to figure out how to work together or compete or struggle against each other in a space where they kind of have to figure it out for themselves, where there's no international 911 service. So that's what we mean when we say an anarchic international environment. And so when we're thinking about who are the relevant actors, political scientists who study international relations, like myself, tend to focus primarily on states, as states being sort of the core actors of the international system. And within the Arctic region, those states that would be active would be the United States, Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. These are sort of the countries that have a territorial claim, a physical presence in the Arctic region. I would also throw in China as a relevant actor for two reasons. One, China is a great power, which means they're able to project force outside of their home region. And two, China has an interest in the Arctic, particularly when it comes to shipping lanes as a way to access the Atlantic in a more efficient way. And so I think China is present in the Arctic in a way that is worth considering for this conversation. And we could talk about these 7 or 8 countries as representing a regional security community where they think about their security in terms of each other and how they're interacting. Many of these countries are tied together through international organizations because they do see their security and their interests as being interlinked. And so a large number of these countries are members of the European Union. Most are members of NATO, excluding China and Russia, Sweden having just applied for membership. They're all certainly part of the United Nations, and certainly the countries that are physically present in the Arctic region are part of the Arctic Council. So there are all of these different forums in which states can coordinate and cooperate and potentially work out their differences and manage their mutual security interests and concerns. So we should talk about what those mutual security interests and concerns actually are and what they look like. And so I've got a series of maps, and maybe I'll just pull these up a little bit larger so folks can maybe dig into what's going on here. And I think I've got 4 or so different maps that highlight different aspects of the geography that ends up being relevant for thinking about security. And so one of those is just where are the population centers. Population centers end up being really important because they sort of anchor a state's presence. They allow for a state to kind of control and control the proximate territory. And they're also sort of centers that are going to be, you want to be able to protect and defend. And most of the population centers in the Arctic region tend to be sort of on the Atlantic coast. There's not a lot sort of in the interior, left and right parts of the circle in northern Russia or northern Canada. But I think what's also noticeable is that there just aren't very many population centers at all in the Arctic. Coastal regions around the world tend to be the most heavily populated regions. They tend to be the most economically active regions. And yet in the Arctic, we see just these sort of small pockets where we see large settlements. And so that makes the Arctic, I think, a somewhat unique or at least different kind of region. We'll talk about maybe the implications of that here in a little bit. So a second feature I think is worth understanding or being aware of are the resources that are available in the Arctic that might draw states in or might give states an additional interest in the Arctic. And when people talk about this, they primarily are talking about oil and gas production, whether that's in sort of northern oil fields that are sort of on land, or whether those are sort of out in the sea or off the coast, and then different mining sites. And so there are certainly significant economic resources in the Arctic that are there for Canada, the United States, Russia, and a handful of others that are present and might give them an interest in directly controlling portions of the Arctic, might give them something to compete over, and might give these states an interest in being present in a visible way in the Arctic to maintain claims over resources, whether they're potential resources or whether they're actively being exploited and developed. A third dimension I think is worth thinking about with the Arctic is its function in terms of transit lanes, that it does provide an efficient link between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, which is nice for a portion of the year. The sort of blue lines and red lines kind of illustrate common trade transit routes, the blue being routes that are open year-round, the red being, PC6, which I believe corresponds to basically summer and fall. You don't have ice covering in there. It's navigable. So it certainly is a viable transit lane and is more efficient during some months than others. But I think there's 2 or 3 things that jump out for me. One is that the year-round lanes cleave very close to Russian territory, whereas Canada and other states are less proximate to those transit lanes. Second thing that is, I think, noteworthy is that there's really only one access point coming from the Pacific, that is through the Bering Strait, and that's a very narrow access point. Whereas the access points to the Atlantic, there's a much wider space. There's many places where you could enter into the Arctic that way. It would be much more difficult to choke off that access point to the Arctic than it would be to control the Bering Strait. So that's maybe something to think about in terms of control over global trade lanes, or even just maintenance of global trade lanes. There's a lot of security cooperation that happens internationally just to support existing trade lanes in the less Arctic regions of the world, in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, so that if ships get into trouble, there's search and rescue, there's the ability to reach them and make sure that the trade lanes are safe and free of piracy. So there's significant global cooperation around that, but in the Arctic region, that sphere of cooperation is going to be taking place very close to Russia and Russia's coast. And then a final thing to highlight would be territorial claims. In the international system, the vast majority of conflicts occur over territorial disputes. There are a couple territorial disputes in the Arctic region that are worth highlighting, both just to be aware of, but also because of some of their quirkiness. So there is a territorial dispute between Canada and Denmark over a small island that sits between Greenland and northern Canada. It's been in dispute for many, many years, and Denmark and Canada wage what is, I guess, comically described as the Whiskey War. And what that means is that periodically agents of Canada will show up on the island and provide a bottle of whiskey with a note to Denmark saying, you know, we're here on our island, just thought we'd leave this for you in case you got cold. And then representatives from Denmark would, you know, arrive on the island, they'd take the bottle of whiskey and they'd leave their own with a note for Canada saying, yeah, we were here, sorry we missed you, you know, here's a bottle of whiskey for you, and just back and forth. And what they're essentially doing is marking that this is territory where I have an active, sustained, ongoing presence. I'm just sort of keeping it going, that I consider this to be my territory, but doing it in a way that's not likely to escalate into conflict, although maybe the whiskey bill for Denmark and Canada ends up being more excessive than it might otherwise be. We see similar kinds of activities of states trying to mark territory. A number of years back, Russia planted a Russian flag underneath the North Pole, underneath the ice, as a way of signaling what it had as a claim over a significant chunk of ocean that wouldn't be typically recognized under international law. And so typically the way that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea works is that states get to claim 3 to 12 miles off their coast as their territorial waters, and that's an area that they can control as sovereign territory. They can say who comes in and who goes out. They can restrict that, control that, and treat that as their territory. But then you can extend out another 200 miles from the coast, and that zone, which is kind of the area demarcated in, I guess, with the red line, and then going back toward the coastlines, that is exclusive economic zones, which means that only that state that has that as their exclusive economic zone can do deep sea mining, can do fishing, can do resource extraction from that territory. They get to control that, but others can transit through it, right? And so this allows for travel, but it also recognizes the right of states to fish and operate off their coasts. But in the Arctic, that creates this sort of, I don't know, bubble or donut hole, I guess, in the center, where there's a chunk of territory which most of the year is covered by ice. I shouldn't say territory, a chunk of ocean, which most of the year is covered by ice, that isn't owned by anybody in terms of international law, in terms of claims over the resources in those areas. And so it is possible for fishing vessels to show up in the summer and fall and park in that sort of donut hole in the center and catch fish as they swim from Russian exclusive economic zones into Canadian exclusive economic zones, which is, I think, a point of concern. But it's also been the case that Russia has expressed a desire to extend their exclusive economic zone well beyond the sort of standard 200 miles off of your coast, and that is a claim that is in dispute and that others have not fully recognized and could be a source of conflict or tension in the Arctic region. Okay, so we've kind of looked at some of the geography of the Arctic and how that might affect security, and talked about some of the wrinkles around that. I'd like to highlight a couple things. So one thing I noticed when I look at the Arctic region is that there are these really long coastlines that a number of countries have, right? Russia, Canada, even the United States, Denmark and Norway all have very long coastlines, and those coastlines are very sparsely populated. The presence of these countries in these regions is not as dense as it is in other parts of their territory. We talked about how the Pacific Ocean has a choke point, access to the Arctic through the Bering Strait, but the Atlantic Ocean doesn't. That maybe creates a different asymmetry of where states might focus military power. But then there's also some technology elements that are different in terms of operating in the Arctic compared to other regions. Historically, force projection has been really difficult because it's super cold, right? That you have to be able to operate in an environment that is a harsh environment for a good chunk of the year. And you have to have specialized equipment, particularly if you're operating in a naval capacity. You're going to need ships that are able to break up ice to be able to keep transit lanes clear, and that requires some specialized machinery, some specialized metallurgy, some specialized equipment. Drones have maybe made operation for purposes of surveillance in the Arctic significantly easier. In the past, it would have required, sailing a ship out with somebody with binoculars or possibly a satellite to be able to observe what's happening out over vast swaths of ice and ocean and territory. But drones have potentially made the surveillance aspect of operating the Arctic much easier. And then finally, the Arctic functions very similarly to other parts of the world for submarines, where they can float underneath. The only thing that's particularly different is that submarines have to kind of punch up through the ice if they want to be able to surface, which they would need to do if they were going to launch nuclear missiles or non-nuclear missiles from an Arctic position. So there's some slight differences in terms of the technology in some ways, and in other ways fairly significant, particularly when it comes to icebreakers. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about arms races. But at this point, I'd like to kind of maybe put in perspective how states are thinking about and operating the Arctic. And I think there's a really useful comparison that I'll share with folks that was made by, well, I'm making the comparison, but it's based off of an observation by David Kilcullen, who's a military strategist that from Australia originally, who's worked for the Department of Defense. And David Kilcullen talks about sort of Australia's military posture in the context of its geography. And so he says the Australian Army is charged with defending an enormous island continent that has only a tiny population of 25 million people, but covers, when external territories are taken into account, almost 1/7 of the globe. So he's describing a situation very similar to what we're seeing in the Arctic. We have these long coastlines, we have these large open ocean spaces, and we have very low population. Then he says Australia is a classic trade-dependent maritime state with a major economic and political partners. So again, there's a trade component to thinking about Australia's security, which I think may be relevant to the Arctic. A number of the states that have interest there specifically because of trade lanes. This unique set of circumstances, I would argue, it's maybe not as unique as Kilcullen thinks, has given rise to a strategic culture of forward defense in which the Australian Defence Force, because it is several orders of magnitude too small to conduct a passive continental defense of its immense area of responsibility, tends to operate primarily as an expeditionary power projection force in the littoral tropical environment of Southeast Asia. So we'll unpack a couple key phrases there. An expeditionary power projection force, that means that they are actively building their military to be able to go out and conduct operations, not necessarily even military operations. It could be search and rescue operations, it could be humanitarian operations, but rather than trying to defend territory at sort of the border, they're operating in this zone in a proactive way to try to intercept problems before they reach their actual borders. And they're operating in this littoral tropical environment. Well, obviously the Arctic isn't tropical, it's Arctic, but the littoral means in sort of a coastal, or you can be accessed from the coast. And so we're thinking much more about a naval force or a being able to land or project force onto coastlines rather than controlling territory with maybe a large army. They're going to send expeditionary forces further afield in support of alliance interests. So there's also an element of we're engaging in cooperation, and engaging in cooperation helps to ensure that our interests are going to be taken into account and they're going to be recognized by all the parties involved. So part of this outward expeditionary focus is an emphasis on area studies, languages, and close engagement with regional military forces. In the Australian system, every Army officer undergoes language testing before graduating from the Military Academy at Duntroon, and officers are expected to become proficient in regional languages. So he's talking about how security in the context of Australia's military, because they're in the situation of low population, long coastlines, you can't possibly control the territory, requires going out and engaging with others, being able to interface with them both so through language and culture, but also through international organizations. Again, translating this into the context of the Arctic, courses like this one that are focused on sort of the various different aspects of the Arctic that are maybe unique, thinking about sort of indigenous issues, thinking about environmental issues, thinking about the geography, thinking about the politics, thinking about all sorts of different aspects of the Arctic are going to be helpful for people who are preparing to operate in the Arctic in support of these sort of expeditionary type foreign policies where you're out and you're engaging, whether that's supporting transit lanes, whether that's monitoring fishing, whether that's search and rescue, or whether that's operating as a military force trying to project force and power over particular disputed territories. I think the Australian comparison works well for us. That having been said, I think it's important to differentiate the different actors in the Arctic are going to want different things, right? And so if you are a regional actor, your interests are primarily going to be focused on your territorial claims in that region, and maybe maintaining cooperation with those other states in the Arctic around common concerns. If you are a maritime state, the state that relies heavily upon transit and trade, right, whether that's China or the United States, you're going to be thinking much more about securing trade lanes than you might if you are not a state that relies heavily on imports and exports, or has trading partners that are more locally. So if you're based in the Atlantic Ocean and you trade primarily within the Atlantic Ocean region, maybe that's less of a concern for you to maintain those trade lanes. If you are a Pacific actor, you may be very concerned about being able to control the Bering Strait, right? Again, this is that critical choke point that may matter a lot for you. If you're an Atlantic actor, controlling the choke points in the Atlantic is a Herculean task, and might not be something that you would even consider as practical or feasible. But for states in the Pacific, whether it's China or Russia or the United States, those might be things that are of grave concern. And then nuclear armed actors may have different priorities, whether that's maintaining surveillance systems, whether that's being able to operate submarines in the Arctic region. Their interests may be different than states that don't have nuclear arsenals, both in terms of things that you might want to be able to do, have submarines operating in the Arctic, but also in terms of maybe not being as concerned about territorial issues, right? That a nuclear deterrence means that you are unlikely to be invaded or attacked because of the potential retaliation, and that we think in international relations adds an extra layer of security or defense, so that the territorial integrity of nuclear armed states is thought to be hopefully more secure in the long run than non-nuclear armed states. And so again, thinking about sort of what makes the Arctic unique, we see a lot of different factors related to geography, but we also need to think about the individual actors that are there, what they might want, and then thinking about how they're cooperating together. And so states that are part of the European Union are much more likely to have forums for that cooperation to sort of build and become deepened. Russia and China are perhaps less integrated into the other Arctic actors than Denmark or Iceland or Canada or the United States, that have multiple forums for cooperation to build and strengthen existing relationships, so they're less likely to see each other as a threat. And this is going to end up being really important when we pivot to our next conversation, which is focused on arms races in the Arctic and whether we are seeing an arms race.